So, one of the things I'd like to start doing here at Chess on Ice is some more off the cuff, sort of informal videos based on things that have just happened in curling, whether it's a recent event or a news story or whatnot. And I thought today we could talk a little bit more about the PointsBet Invitational, the single elimination tournament that we saw over the weekend. Reed Carruthers' team won the men's event. Jennifer Jones won the women's event. Really fun little tournament with that single elimination format that I talked about a bit in the last video I posted. The key thing I want to talk about today, though, is actually one of the rules used in that tournament, which was the draw to the button to determine who won in the case of a tie. Now, again, like we've talked about before, this is not something you'd want to use in an elimination game at the Olympics or something, but it's something a lot of us are very familiar with because a lot of league nights are decided this way, some bonspiels are decided this way, and yeah, it's one of the most common ways across the world of curling to determine who wins a game. Now, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't just change the way we determine who wins. It also can affect how teams can and should approach the last end and the last couple ends of a game heading into that potential tiebreaker. Depending on how your league, your bonspiel, your event is determining what happens in the case of a tie, you should be playing a little differently down the stretch. And I thought this would be a good time to talk about that. Let's look at a few different ways in which games might be decided and see how we should think about the game in each of those scenarios. And broadly speaking, I think there are three ways that this happens. One, you could play an extra end. Obviously, this is considered the most competitive, fairest way, pretty much always used in the knockout stages of important events. Even the new WCF rules that will apply to some of their championships and do use a draw to the button. We'll only use that in the round robin section. We also have the draw to the button style finishes. That can be both a regular draw to the button or some sort of shootout format where everyone on the team gets to throw a rock. And those are slightly different, but I'm going to group those into one lump. And then we also have situations where the end of a game is just a tie. If you are tied at the end of 8 ends or 10 ends, then you split the points or you put a tie in the record book, whatever is the case in your event or league or bonspiel. So let's start by treating the extra end as the baseline. We won't talk about specifics of adjustments you'll make if there's going to be an extra end. Instead, let's just talk about it as if that's the normal way to play. What we know about that is if you go into the extra end without hammer, that's a bad thing, of course. You are more likely than not to lose at any level. I remember when I was a 5 and under curler and talking to some of the other regionally fairly successful 5 and under curlers who were paying attention to these kind of things. We thought it was about a 2-to-1 advantage to have the hammer in the last end or in the extra end in a tie game. As you get more competitive, that number goes up. I think in very more competitive bonspiels, your club's competitive league, at least among the top teams, or in a playdown scenario, you might see it more as a 70-75% edge for the team that has the hammer. And of course, when you get into highly competitive tour play, national level play, and such, it gets even higher, and in some cases significantly higher when you're talking about a handful of top teams in the world, particularly on the men's side. You'll see they make some, what you would say for any other team would be strange strategic decisions right at the end of the game to really avoid getting in that tied without hammer in an extra end scenario because the odds of them winning are just so low against these handful of the best teams in the world. So what does this mean? Well, it means you don't want to be the team that has to score in the final end of regulation, at least as a baseline compared to being the team that has the advantage. Even if you prefer to be down one in that classic down one with, up one without scenario, this is the worst kind of tiebreak scenario, the extra end, to be in that situation, because the problem is that a score of 1 is always a pretty common score in curling, and if you get your 1, you're going to give the other team hammer and a big advantage in the extra end. Certainly not a nightmare scenario by any sense. Obviously, some teams even prefer it, as I said, and it is very close to a 50-50 scenario. That's a topic for another video. But of the scenarios we're going to be talking about, the worst place to be down 1 with is when you're going to play an extra end, because, you're really getting 1 as a bad result for you there. And you can think about it from the other direction as well, that this is the scenario where you're in the best shape if you're up going into the last end, even if you're only up a point or 2 points. It's better when you know there's an extra end coming, where you can force the other team to just tie you if you find yourself in trouble, and then take the hammer in the extra end, as opposed to the other scenarios we're going to talk about, where you'll never get that opportunity. Okay, so looking at extra ends as a baseline, let's move on to the next thing, which is the draw to the button. So I think in most scenarios, it's fair to call the draw to the button pretty close to a 50-50 scenario. A lot of times we like to think we have a big edge or a big deficit in that, like we have a big disadvantage. It's just not the case. Even we saw this weekend, like even the best curlers in the world can throw a real bad rock on their draw to the button and lose to just about anyone. Rachel Homan came up way short on a draw to the button, for instance, playing this weekend at the PointsBet Invitational. And that's, of course, not typical for her. I mean, I've played in some events where you use a draw to the button to determine who has hammer at the start of a game, and I have scored or won the hammer against curlers way, way better than me. One time we played the McEwen rink and got the hammer against Mike McEwen. Didn't help us that much, but just saying, that happens. And then we've played people who we thought, oh, we're a much better team then, but for the draw of the button, it's one shot, and, you lose it to them. So, yeah, like, I would not put too much stock into thinking you're better at draws or worse at draws than the other person. Doesn't mean it's always 50-50. Of course, if you went out on the ice and started doing, like, practice last shot draws against a much weaker curler, you're going to win more than half the time, and you're playing a much better curler, you're going to lose more than half the time. But unless it's a very extreme difference between the two players or the two teams, I would think that going into this skips rock for deciding who wins the game is pretty close to a coin toss. So that changes things a bit, right? It's certainly more of a coin toss than having the hammer or not having the hammer in the last end. So what we're going to think about more now is that compared to the extra end, being down with the hammer is less of a disadvantage and may actually have a clear advantage in some ways for you. Say you're down 1 with the hammer going into a final end, and you know that skip rocks are coming. Well, we already know it's about a 50-50 proposition when there is an extra end, and you have that disadvantage of getting 1 puts you in a real bad situation in the extra end. Now you definitely have the edge, because if you get in trouble early in the end, you have no issue, or I shouldn't say no issue, but it is not a big deal if you have to bail out, take your 1, and then let it come down to what is essentially, in most situations, pretty close to a coin toss. In fact, you might even say that you really want to angle to maybe have the hammer needing to score in the final end of a close game, or of course having the hammer tied, but we're talking about less than ideal scenarios, close game scenarios where both teams have reasonably equal chances going to the last end. You'll hear a lot about even end advantage when you watch curling on TV or even in discussions of curling strategy. Some other time on this channel, and it'll probably come up more than once, I'll talk about why I think that's overemphasized. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just saying that people put a little too much stock into that. But when you're dealing with a situation where there's a draw to the button at the end of the game, I think the even end advantage, just like the advantage of having the hammer and needing to score in the last end, is bigger. These are situations in which this matters more. So if you're playing an 8-end game and you can get the hammer in 6 and 8 in a close game, and you won't have to play an extra end in 9 where, the fact that you had the hammer and tied the game in 8 doesn't really work out that well for you, then yeah. So in a draw to the button scenario or a tie scenario where there is no extra end and no tiebreaker, then yeah, I think you pay more attention to keeping the hammer in the extra ends than you normally would even. And I think you are happier to get in a scenario where you have to score 1 or even 2 with the hammer in the 8th, knowing you're going into those situations without the disadvantage of potentially having to play an extra end without hammer. There is one other variation on this sort of draw to the button idea that's worth talking about, and that's the shootout format where like everyone gets to throw a rock, and most often you get points based on what ring the rock ends up on your draws. Could be a total measure or something like that too. I think you treat this a lot like the draw to the button scenario, except that because you're now getting into where both teams are throwing 4 shots, the variance does go down a little bit. And if your team is way better or way worse at drawing, or you're just way less precise than the other team or way more precise, you can consider that sort of in your calculations. In other words, this situation comes somewhere between having an extra end and having a pure draw to the button. I can remember one scenario when I was a fairly new curler and came close to pulling an upset against a strong junior team at a Bonspiel. We came into the final end down 1 with hammer, and if anything, in that situation, it was not better than if there was an extra end. It might have been somewhat worse, because the problem was we knew that if we scored 1, this team was going to be extremely precise on their shootout, which was the tiebreaker. They were going to throw 4 rocks, and chances are all of them were, or most of them at least, would be in the 4-footer on the button. Of course, like I said, everyone misses at times, even the best curlers in the world, but over the course of 4 shots, they'd be able to adjust and learn better and make more of them than we probably would. We'd probably just have to get a little bit lucky to keep up with them in that, and our odds of winning were going to be pretty low. So what happened was we actually got into some trouble early in the end, didn't set up well, and I asked my team, normally I'd be willing to bail out here and take our chances in the draw to the button or the shootout, but given who we're playing, do you think we should really press hard for a deuce here, even though the end doesn't look good? Sure enough, the team was totally on board for that, so we did try really hard, just missed getting our deuce, did score 1, and kind of as we expected, the other team just absolutely rocked the draws to the button for the shootout and beat us in the tiebreaker. But it was a really good game, and that's something to think about too, that those shootouts, you might be able to think that the advantage and disadvantage is a bit bigger than just with a single draw to the button, if you think one team is definitely better than the other in that situation. All right, so finally, let's talk about the situation where if the game is tied after 8 or 10 ends, the game is just a tie. This happens in some leagues. I recently instituted this in our competitive league at my club, which I run, just to sort of save time over the course of a night. The early draw ends earlier this way. When we looked at like ways to speed up the entire night, turned out just eliminating 9th ends was the best way to go, because that was the biggest culprit in making people wait a long time to start their second game, or being stuck at the club till 11:30 or midnight if they had a late draw. So how does this change things? Well, of course, the tie is a 50-50 proposition if you're splitting points. So you know exactly how much a tie is worth, unlike maybe in the draw of the button or shootout scenarios where you're kind of thinking it's 50-50-ish, but it might not be. One team might have an advantage. Nobody has an advantage in a tie situation. So you can go in treating the possibility as a tie as like half a win most of the time. What does that mean for you like in the last end? Again, we go back to that being down with the hammer situation. Down 1 or 2 points with the hammer. The value of that definitely goes up because you don't have to worry about playing in the extra end. In all these scenarios too, The value of being down one without the hammer is certainly better because you don't have to steal twice or get a steal of two. Certainly have a better chance of stealing once than you do stealing more than once. I haven't brought this up before because it's not a scenario you're typically trying to get into. But if you're in the second to last end and you have a chance, and you're gonna take maybe one less point than you need to tie with the hammer, that looks a little better to you when you know that if you steal, you are just getting into a tiebreaker or a straight tie, as opposed to knowing you're gonna steal, play an extra end, and then have to steal again. This scenario, however, is one where you really have to consider the situation you're in your event or league. There will be times where a tie is very bad for you or even isn't enough for you. Say it's the last game of a round robin where ties are allowed or the last game of the regular season at your club league, and you know a tie won't get you into the playoffs or win the league, but a win would. In that case, you're obviously not going to play for it. The tie ends up being worth 0. It's worse than an extra end. And the opposite can be true too. You can know that a tie clinches a playoff spot for you. Or you can feel that a tie is a great result against a much stronger team. In those cases, you may treat a tie basically like a win. Obviously, in the qualification scenario, you would treat it like a win. When you're talking about playing a much stronger team where you feel like even a tie is an upset, you shouldn't value it as much as winning, but certainly maybe it's better than a 50-50. It's better than half a win because you're getting way more out of the game than you expected to going in. It's interesting to think about this when it comes to the World Curling Federation events where they are adding in a draw to the button to determine a winner, but a win is worth 3 points and a loss is worth 0 points. However, if you get to the draw to the button, the loser of the draw to the button gets a point and the winner gets 2 points. What's really interesting about this is that it really brings in a lot of thought about where you stand in the round robin and how many points your team needs when you're getting into that scenario. One thing to keep in mind is that even if you win the draw to the button, once you get to that draw to the button, you can never get that full 3 points anymore. So you are losing something just by getting to that scenario. You're also winning something because you're taking 0 points out of the equation. So there will be, again, times, especially late in the round robin, where it is clearly correct to be 100% fine with going to the draw to the button, because all you need is a point to clinch or put yourself in a situation where you feel very confident about clinching. And there'll be other times where it's 100% wrong to allow that to happen because you absolutely need the full 3 points, and even winning the draw to the button doesn't help you very much. In sort of the long run, playing an equalish team early in the round robin sense where you're not considering these kind of scenarios, you can treat this almost like a tie. Obviously, you want to take the draw to the button very seriously as you would in any tiebreaker. But if you figure you're playing a fairly equal team where you're going to win the draw to the button about 50% of the time, you're going to average 1.5 points in those situations. And over the long run, it'll be just like you split the points. Of course, some teams will feel they're better or worse at the draw of the button, and that might tweak strategy just the slightest bit because maybe you're averaging a bit more or a bit less than 1.5 points. But that's really getting into the nitty-gritty, and that's going to be up to the individual team. So yeah, this was a bit of a rambling discussion on this topic, but I hope it helps a little bit to at least get you thinking about how to approach these late-game scenarios and how they change just a little bit when you're changing what the rules are, whether it's a draw to the button, a shootout, a straight tie, or you're playing an extra end. I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that the value of tying the game in the last end is way better when there isn't an extra end. So no matter how you feel about the up with down, or sorry, down with up without sort of scenarios, down with gets way better when you don't have to play an extra end, because now you're either winning or getting into a coin flip instead of winning or getting into a pretty bad situation. Anyway, hope this has all been helpful and an interesting discussion. If you have any comments on the topic, feel free to leave them below. I'll tell you the same things we always do. Like and subscribe to help keep this channel growing. We have a lot of subscribers on this channel, but would love to get even more and really help this grow this season. I'm committed to making a lot of content and hope you'll come along for the ride with me. That's it for now, but stay tuned. There'll be much more content coming soon here on Chess on Ice. Hope to see you back soon.